Just to recap, this is Nook and Adam. Nook's nickname, no relation to the English word. She's from Thailand, I'm from the US. We've been working and living in Saudi Arabia where I teach English and she cooks the food for the other teachers and people. And sometimes it's very eye-opening. We get to see things that not too many people will see. Live in a place that has mostly been exclusive. And we have a little fun, get out in the desert, do a lot of shopping for Nook's Kitchen. But when we had time this last summer in 2021, we'd head out of Bahrain and took off on a road trip around the country. We head out of Michigan, drove south through Ohio, then to Kentucky, Tennessee, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, through and across Texas, New Mexico. We stopped at 2 restaurants up to that point, relying instead on Nook's superior cooking. And by the time we arrived in New Mexico and then Arizona, well, we were ready to wash some clothes at the laundromat and then head up to the Grand Canyon, where we saw spectacular views, hiked down to the bottom and back. But what I haven't mentioned is that we were carrying a lot of money across this country. So every time I got out of the car at the rest stop, at the gas station to take a hike, to go camping, to walk to the bottom of the Grand Canyon and back, I was carrying my friend Mike's nearly $10,000 with me, which we agreed to deliver to his parents in Bakersfield, California. What a very peculiar sense this is, to have your friend's money with you all the way across the country. And so sure, I was able to kind of forget about that most of the time and watch the natural landscape change and into a new look, new state, new desert by a different name across the west part of the United States. But always in the back of my mind there was this nagging feeling as we drove, especially on that May 26th day out to Bakersfield to meet Mike's parents for the drop-off at Salty's, the third and I believe last restaurant that we went to on this entire road trip. We looked at the Joshua trees in the Mojave Desert, and I felt such a sense of relief that I would get rid of this $10,000 or nearly, because if I had lost that, it's not like losing my money. I would be furious and sad and a number of other emotions that I would not be ashamed of had I lost my own money. But if it were a friend's money, there would then be this whole other side of, well, how could he be sure that I didn't just take it? And oh my God, do I owe this man this money? So we drove what was one of our longest drives that day. We would have maybe avoided Bakersfield if it weren't for Mike Otto's parents, but that was the closest that they could meet us or would be expected to meet us coming out of Grover Beach there in California. And I really wanted to make it about as easy as them as possible.
But I prefer a small gallet like my dad grows. It's more flavor.
So they could take the hand off and then
Big gallet doesn't taste.
Send it out to Mexico where Mike was buying his dream retirement property in Fume Sings. And sure enough, just as we came across the new landscape, we were into California and on the highways, down into Bakersfield, and it seemed that across most of California,
I don't know what they're doing there.
It was nearly all Christian radio and Mexican radio.
Like,
And so we listened to quite a bit of that Mexican radio. That's some lively jazz there. I like that.
yeah, I have no idea. It's side road or what? Or just for, it's like a sport something? Like monster truck drive up to.
It's very well maintained. It doesn't look like anything's been.
So what she's asking about is the road that's on the side of the highway here on this private property that has all this burnt yellow grass that I'm just not quite sure what that's all about. I've never seen that before. So it looked like grazing lands, but we didn't really see any cattle. It wasn't farmland because it wasn't irrigated.
Does it have an owner? Very dry. Is it somebody land?
Somebody later told me that's why they call it.
That part can see green, and that means
That's why they call it the Golden State, because all this dried grass. And sure enough, that must be why fires start and spread so easily out there.
See, they have some farm there.
Just for hundreds of miles, there's this burnt, dried grass. It must be alive. It was like hay.
Wow,
And then down in the valley,
opposite.
well, sure enough, there's probably almond farms, and we
Big farm there.
found some apricots
The left side.
and the most delicious cherries I've ever tasted. They were actually sweet, not sour or tart.
Big farm.
And of course, these green farms in the midst of all this dried, arid land is probably why California suffers drought or suffers water shortages all the time.
See? Green. That side, nothing. No tree. That side have farm.
And so, being that Sengtong grew up on the farm up there in the Karen village, he was, of course, always ready and happy to see some farms, see how different farms are doing their business. And the vast stretches of farmland that we saw across the United States were unlike anything that we'd seen before. They're just so vast, so big. So it was time to deliver the money, and oh my goodness, were we happy. So we went to the wrong Salties there in Bakersfield, too. We finally made it to Salties, where Mike Otto's parents were. Made a call with him on video, took a couple photos, and I didn't argue when the parents
Wow.
wanted to pay for our meal there, considering that
I never see almond tree.
it was a lot of money to bring to them.
It's like bush, though.
And it was a sigh of relief there.
It's a tree.
Oh, huh.
So then we were out of Bakersfield and up into Kings Canyon. This was the first day that I actually had to drive in the dark.
Nature or the farm? Wow.
And unfortunately, this was
A solar cell. Wow, so many solar cells.
probably the worst possible route on the entire trip that I'd have to drive in the dark, because going up into Kings Canyon around the switchbacks and
Grapes
everything,
farm.
oh, it was pretty bad. So the sun went down and I got nauseous with so many curves. I couldn't even see out of my peripheral vision coming around those curves in the Kings Canyon. But we made it to the campsite, and it being my birthday, Nook had a nice little birthday thing with a wonderful birthday pie. Sorry, we had to sit in the car all day.
Yes, celebrate kind of little late today. Love you. Happy 33 years old.
So tired and kind of strung out from the road, Adam and Sangtong said goodnight there at Kings Canyon. Woke up the next day, had a delicious meal. You can see the full episode of Nook's Country Kitchen there, link available in the description. Packed up our tent. Mom and Dad said goodbye to Kings Canyon. We went down into Sequoia National Park. We had a little walk around the giant trees. Saw General Sherman and the other giants there. Just kind of marveled at the very, very different types of...
I'll go through one time and then I'll back up. I'll ask him, I'll back up.
You can go circle.
Wow!
Wow. Slow down, honey. Slow down. So can we ask him? We can go turn, honey.
Yeah.
very different type of trees there. You could even drive through them twice. Had our hike around, took some photos, and Nook was still suffering a little bit from heat stroke, maybe from the desert, from the Grand Canyon, and then maybe a little altitude sickness that day. So we didn't take much of a long hike, just drove and then got out of the car and hiked around near the car, took photos, took Mom and Dad around again, since they rarely get out of the village, and even if they had the money, they wouldn't, because money goes a lot farther than even we went in the United States. So looking at all this and all nature's splendor, of course, constant theme of the trip, very grateful and just humbled and amazed at the natural beauty and the diversity, the ecological, geological, geographic diversity of the country. But after a quick tour around the trees, it was time to get back down out to, I believe it's Woodland, and then across 3 rivers or somewhere thereabouts up to the other campsite that we stayed at near Yosemite. Yosemite was booked solid. Well, they had closed down most of the campsites, so the ones that were still open were booked solid to the entire time. I could have went to the Yosemite Valley Camp 5 or whatever it is right there next to El Cap and waited in the morning, try to get a campsite, but I figured it's best just to head a lodgepole and stay at Spring Cove there near Bass Lake. And so we had our campsite reserved. We were out down the mountain again, across the plains a little bit, following family campers and station wagons and things, till we got out on the open road. The drive during the day certainly was better than the drive at night. And so we got back out onto these farmlands and stretches of yellow grass, and I spotted a sign that said fresh cherries. I mentioned a moment ago. I said, well, that sounds good. So I turned around, I got some fresh cherries, and wow, am I glad that we met that lady right there, whose cherries were so delicious. And from there we stayed at Spring Cove for 2 nights and went up into and around Yosemite. We got into Yosemite a couple different directions. And once again, just witnessing the different types of rocks, different types of trees and soils and other foliage and plants and flora there. Behind a lot of very slow-moving vehicles much of the time, but nonetheless, it was a beautiful scenic drive, and it's a good thing that we enjoyed the views because we spent a long time on the road in the car, obviously. So moving up and around and through the mountains and next to the river, listening to a lot of Mexican music and some Christian radio and the Sirius XM that came stock standard included in the rental. Enjoying our time together. Happy, amazed. Wow, so we got to drive through a tree
Big
yesterday,
rock.
and today a rock.
A rock, giant rock.
The simple things, you know? Away from the cities,
Oh, it's
away from the giant parties and madness.
Beautiful.
It's very simple, very kind of slow, natural.
Wow, look at giant rock. Everything giant,
Yeah, beautiful.
California. Giant tree, giant mountain, giant rock.
Giant sense of appreciation.
Beautiful natural.